my young queer kid me, who read a bunch of queer theory and wrote every research paper they possibly could on, queer shit, definitely would hate who I am today. Hey guys, it's Kat and it's time for another episode of True Tea. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me for this episode. I've really appreciated those of you guys who are here every single Tuesday, giving me your brew, telling me how you feel. This series is all about me sharing my most raw, unedited feelings, and I appreciate those of you guys who have stepped forward and shared your raw and unedited feelings. I've had so many people who have been following me for years just leaving their first comment, and I always appreciate, the long-time watcher, first-time commenter comments. Thank you so much for participating in my community. It really does mean a lot to me, and I mean that from the very bottom of my heart. I want you to give me your fresh brew, whether you think I'm gonna like it or not. So yeah. Anyway, before we jump into this video, I wanted to give you a couple of church announcements. I'm going to be at VidCon. I'm gonna be doing a fan meetup and a bunch of panels, and I'll have exclusive merch all at VidCon. And if you have not gotten your tickets, I do highly suggest that you go and do that. There's going to be a link in the description box below for you to find where you can get tickets to VidCon. I believe that if you go on Saturday, the ticket is only $60 and you guys get a lot out of that. So yeah, come see me. It's gonna be a fun time. Anyway, we're gonna have a very interesting conversation in this video. So as usual, I do suggest that we go to our kitchens and grab ourselves some tea. Personally, I am drinking some Jade Citrus tea. Once again, I'm not done with my Teavana bags yet. I really wanted to go through all this. This is like the best tea I've ever owned. So we're gonna keep drinking it. And I need a very thick sip of tea before we get into this, because I have a feeling that this is gonna upset some people, but maybe it's not, I don't know. So, we are gonna be talking about something that I've wanted to discuss on my channel for a while. And if you guys are my hardcore long-term followers, you've probably heard me say variations of this. And I do wanna say, here we go, another disclaimer. I know that for some of these True Tea videos, I have been repeating things that I've said before. Some of you guys are like, girl, we heard the story a year ago. I appreciate those comments and I appreciate that you've been following me this long. But for those of you guys who've been following, all of my content, that all of my rants on my rant channel are gone. I don't really do a lot of live broadcasts on Facebook anymore. So for me right now, True Tea in this form is me really trying to just consolidate all of those things into one series that I'm not gonna delete, something that I can actually be proud of. So bear with me. We are going to be talking about how I, despite many people's wishes, am not queer, right? And this is a conversation that I've wanted to have very delicately, because I don't want anything I say in these videos to come off as me being like, being queer is a bad thing, identifying that way is a bad thing, because I definitely don't feel that way. I just really wanted to discuss my personal sort of reactions to people who want to put me into that category. And it's interesting because I actually do have two minds when it comes to this, And one of the big reasons why I wanted to talk about this is because when I was asking you guys, for True Tea topic suggestions, so many of you guys asked me about certain things that are specific to the queer community. I mean, one of the requests was racism in the queer community, right? And this is kind of something that I would also say in relation to the Black community. I have a hard time understanding what people always mean when they say those things, because, I've never, until this past couple of years, lived in a predominantly Black community. And when it comes to the queer community, I've really never lived in or worked in or needed a community of queer people. And so I feel weird when people ask me to speak about some of those things from a position of authority, because these are both things I've found myself not to necessarily need in life. I mean, we'll do a whole other video about the Black community stuff. Let's not get derailed, but I am generally the sort of person who doesn't like to organize around an identity or a moniker that could be projected onto me. And so that's sometimes why I have not such a positive reaction to that. So yeah. So I guess I wanted to, start from the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I wanted to talk about what queer has meant to me, queer as a word has meant to me throughout my life, and why I no longer identify that way. Now, again, this is something that some of you guys have already heard. Feel free to skip this video, but for those of you guys who are new, stay right here. So when I was much younger, like when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, I spent a lot of time on the internet, right? And it's really interesting to observe the way that these conversations have shifted and changed over the years, because queer, in what it meant to me back then, in the early 2000s, has become something very, very different today. Super, 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 super different. Now, when I was younger and I was still discovering and figuring things out about my gender, I identified as queer. And my identity as queer kind of came from a very loud, I would almost say radical idea of my gender and what it meant. For me, being queer, wasn't just being different than a cis person or a straight person, which is the definition that a lot of people like to use. For me, being queer was about actively disrupting all spaces, queering spaces, as we would call it, to draw attention to the disparities between gender roles and, the silliness of gender and the silliness of a binary gender. And so I would spend a lot of time very openly and loudly talking about this stuff, and openly and loudly being an example of someone who was breaking those stereotypes, right? Now, that's who I was when I was younger. And whenever I have this conversation, I'm always very delicate to discuss it, because I don't want anything to sound like what I'm saying is it was just a phase or anything like that. But with time and new environments, like you guys will probably hear this very common theme throughout my life, where when I go to a new environment, I discover new things about myself. And I recognize that maybe when I was in the other environment, I wasn't totally being as genuine, or maybe I wasn't having a position that was informed by actual experience. It was just position informed by, a lot of what ifs and maybes. But when I went away to college, I had the realization that a lot of my queer identity, a lot of my identity as a gender queer person, came from me wanting to be who I really was, right? And also maintain the person that people had already accepted me to be, right? And so a lot of my queerness was not really me being, in retrospect, genuine to who I actually was. It was a lot of me trying to find a way to, maybe do a little of like the feminine shit that I wanted to do, while also holding on to people who had accepted me, as a boy, right? And so I needed to have that little sort of wishy-washy space of, neither here nor there. But when I went away to college, it was very clear to me that I was not queer, and that I was just a boring, trans woman who was straight, and there was a part of me that was like a little bit disappointed by that realization, even though it was like me coming to understand who I was. But, I recognized that I wasn't as unique or interesting as I sort of thought that I was. But it was also encouraging, because I started to really see sort of a path for myself in terms of what I wanted to do and who I wanted to be and who I was going to be when I got older, right? That's when I started to research more about, transition and things, and then eventually, went that route. But it's definitely something that made me feel a lot of, comfort when I recognized that about myself. And queer for a while was also that thing that made me feel very comfortable. But one of the big reasons why I don't identify as queer is because once I understood that I was a binary trans woman, I very much assimilated into the role of a woman in society, I was no longer trying to challenge these ideas about gender. I was no longer trying to point out my lack of being a man or a woman. I was a woman, and that was that, and I was no longer being this kind of outspoken, radical queer kid. I wanted the opposite. I wanted to fade into the background and have no one know anything about me, right? And that is the complete opposite of how I felt initially. My young queer kid me, who read a bunch of queer theory and wrote every research paper they possibly could on, queer shit, definitely would hate who I am today. You know, I'd be like, you know, she's cool or whatever, and it's great that she's out there, but she's sitting over here, assimilated, privileged, not calling shit out, and she's clearly the sort of person who is going to allow herself to get through certain things while not drawing attention, you know, to her transness, right? And that's the reality. And so now today, I don't feel that comfort with claiming queerness, right? So that's kind of why I don't identify as queer. Now, to discuss my interactions with queer communities, right? I've talked about this before, but when I was much younger, and I was, you know, in this radical queer space, I wanted nothing more, and this is such a silly thought to think of right now, I wanted nothing more than to go to Tiger Heat. Now, if you're from LA, you know, Tiger Heat is like the 18 plus, you know, LGBT event that happens, you know, in LA. And I wanted nothing more than to be at Tiger Heat, you know, thotty bopping around. Like, that's what I wanted to do, is just be in this kind of community of, you know, queer people, right? But at the time I was living, you know, in the San Gabriel Valley. I didn't drive. My friends who were very queer affirming definitely didn't want to go to those clubs. And it was far away. You know, it was very far away, right? And of course, when I went away to college, I thought, well, maybe now I'm gonna be able to go, right? And then of course, living in Valencia, very far away from LA. And so it definitely kind of became this thing where there were so many times in my life where I wanted to participate in a queer community, but it never really happened, right? When I was in college, I was part of the Queer Arts Collective. And it was basically a bunch of, you know, LGBTQIA plus people coming together to make art and to, you know, share in creativity, right? The problem with the club was that Cal Arts was already such a queer affirming campus that no one wanted to come to the event, right? And so a lot of my attempts at wanting to participate, you know, in these spaces kind of just didn't end up working out. And while this is all going on, I'm transitioning, assimilating closer and closer to just being a straight girl, right? And so I didn't have the experience of having a queer community. I didn't have an experience of having a queer safe space. My trajectory truly was that once I figured out that I was a binary trans person, I had like a year or so of awkwardness, and then I was stealth, right? And then that was how I lived my life. And a lot of you guys met me at a time where I had given up the idea of being stealth. And that was a whole journey that I had to go through to want to be openly known as a transgender person, right? And so that's kind of my life. And the reason why I have the reaction I do to people, you know, wanting to associate me with queerness is it's complicated, because on one hand, okay, a lot of the reason why I make these videos, a lot of the reason why I still am on YouTube and I'm vocal and I'm open as a trans person is because when I was a teenager and I would try to imagine who I would be as an adult, I would close my eyes and I would see nothing, right? I had no idea what the future me would be like, right? And I recognize that considering what I've been through, considering who I am, considering how long I've been on this platform. I mean, some of you guys know I've been making YouTube videos since I was 15 years old. I'm 28. I have the confidence, the security, you know, and frankly, the privilege to be able to come onto YouTube, claim my transness, and really not worry about it really impacting my life in a way that I can't handle anymore. You know, I've been doing this too long. I've been in the game too long for it to be really something that honestly gets to me. You know, I am not really ashamed of being transgender, right? And I'm not hiding it anymore. It's not a thing that I am afraid of people knowing about me per se. But at the same time, I've also recognized that I have a lot of resentment towards the idea of me always having to have this label on me. Like, one of the things that always baffles me is when people describe me as a transgender blogger, right? Because yes, I'm a trans person who blogs That's definitely who I am. But the vast majority of my content is not about me being transgender, you know, and I don't want my content to be, you know, transgender blogging. You know, you will never find me self-describing myself as a transgender blogger. You will find me just self-describing myself as an artist, an illustrator, a feminist, but I guess I don't identify, I guess you could say, with my transness. My transness is part of who I am, and I'm not denying it. But to me, being trans is, you know, a footnote in my life. It's not the headline, if that makes any sense. You know, it's in the sources, but it's not necessarily the, I gotta really take this metaphor to the, it's not the premise. Do you know what I mean? And that's kind of why it frustrates me so much. But at the same time, like I said, one of the reasons why I'm on this channel is because I want for people to be able to see a functioning, vibrant, you know, trans person. But I deeply resent the idea that I have to go through my life with my transness being some important thing when it's really not. And it's really frustrating sometimes because I've definitely noticed the ways in which I've been pigeonholed into certain conversations, you know, like, and why I have such an issue with that is I have a lot to say about being a trans person. I've got a lot to say about my experiences, the shit that I've gone through, the good, the bad, the ugly. I've got a lot to say, right? But I'm also, and I say this all the time, and I don't know if people hear it, I'm incredibly fucking privileged. I'm incredibly privileged. You know, I've talked about this several times on my channel, but I go through life without informing everybody that I meet that I'm transgender. And I can do that because I have passing privilege, right? That has made my life exponentially easier, right? And so when you have, coupled with, you know, when you have me not having a lot of experience in, I guess you could say, the queer community or the trans community, you know, me not having that, you know, plus living in a way where the people who meet me in my daily life have no clue that I'm transgender. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't know that I'm trans until they accidentally stumble on one of my YouTube videos where I'm talking about it. You know, that's just the way that I live my life. I don't always feel, because those things together, those things coupled, I don't always feel like I'm the right person to have the conversation. And I often feel like there are more, I guess you could say, vital people that should be having these conversations. You know, I have dealt with a lot of shit because I'm transgender, yes, but I can't genuinely say that I've experienced a lot of discrimination on the basis of me being transgender, because most people in my life had no goddamn clue. That's why for me, a lot of my content is about race, it's about sexism, it's about misogyny, it's about those things, because my experience as a Black woman is what I feel more deeply in my daily life than my experience as a trans person. And the reason why this conversation is hard for me is because I always feel like when I voice this, I'm disappointing people. A lot of people don't like to hear about passing. They don't like to hear the reality of me not navigating through this world, telling everybody that I'm trans, because I guess they imagine me being this like super outspoken, always drawing attention to myself kind of person, and that's just not who I am. And I don't want to disappoint people by doing the things that make me feel happy and sane. You know, there was a time in my life where I could not have a conversation without acknowledging my transgenderness. There was a time when I couldn't, not even one. But now it feels like a silly thing to bring up. It seems like a silly thing for me to draw attention to, you know? And as a 28-year-old adult, you know, with, I guess, the privilege that I have, do I feel the need to be connected to a queer community? Not at all. No, I don't. But I think a lot of that is just the result of me maybe being, when I was younger, in a situation where I tried to connect with a community and it just never really panned out. And so I had to learn to stand on my own 2 feet. And it is another topic for another video, but one of the things I've recognized about myself is that, you know, I don't limit myself to where I go and who I associate with, the friends I make, and the kind of places that I go because I'm transgender. I go wherever I want to go. You know, and this is something I noticed when I moved to LA. And, you know, a lot of my YouTube friends, you know, they're LGBTQIA+, and I never see them at the clubs that I go to. I never see them at the bars that I go to. In fact, they wouldn't go to the places that I go because for them, those places are too straight, you know? I remember I was in a karaoke bar and I was there with my bisexual friend. I mean, she's bisexual, but she definitely doesn't really like dealing with men. So like she'll deal with a man occasionally, but she's definitely more sapphic than not. And so we were in this bar and it was like this loud group of guys, you know, singing a song, and I'm sitting there, you know, with my drink, smiling, being cute and shit. And she's like, this is the straightest thing I've ever experienced, you know? And she was clearly uncomfortable. She was clearly uncomfortable in that space. And I just find myself so at home in those spaces. Like, you know, I've made the joke on here that like when I travel, I go directly to the hick bar. You know, I go directly to the biker bar. I go directly to the places where I guess a lot of people would assume I wouldn't go because I'm trans, but I'm not a person who limits what I'm doing in my life because I'm trans. But again, that's privilege. Again, I have the privilege to be able to do that. I can walk into a bar and not have to worry about people knowing that I'm trans and attacking me because of it. That's privilege, right? So kind of going back to what I said before, I feel really weird when people want me to speak to that experience because it's not really one that I have, you know? It's not truly an experience that I have, right? And so, you know, yeah, and I will say this, and this is the two minds. Let me get a drink before I get into this part. Now, all that being said, right? When I said that I'm of two minds on this, here's where I'm at, you know? People projecting queerness onto me bothers me in that I don't think it is a faithful representation of who I am. You know, I don't think it's a very honest representation of who I am. I don't personally feel like I represent queer people in America because my situation is super different and I'm also incredibly heterosexual, right? That being said, I've allowed myself to be in a situation where people can project things onto me. You know, I'm not upset at the, you know, little queer kid in their room who is looking for someone to, you know, feel reflected on, right? Who looks at me and says, you know, that's my queer icon, you know? Because at the end of the day, that's why I'm here. You know, I want to be able to encourage and uplift people, even if it's not something that necessarily identifies with myself. I want you to be able to look at me and say, I see myself in her, you know, or I don't see myself in her, right? So I'm okay in a lot of ways with people projecting that onto me, which is why I always will give, you know, a coming out day talk and I will, you know, participate in these LGBT panels because I do genuinely feel like these are important conversations to be had and that there is a need for young queer and trans kids to be able to look up to someone and see their future realized in front of them, you know? So I'm okay with that. I am okay with that in so many ways. I just also want to express that I feel kind of guilty sometimes when people project that onto me because I don't live the way I guess people assume that I do. And I've been in so many situations where people have expressed sexual interest in me, right? Where women have expressed sexual interest in me and then expressed disappointment in my lack of interest in women. And it's weird because I don't think I've ever presented or communicated that I am anything other than a straight woman, but I feel like I'm disappointing people when I say that I'm not into women. I feel like I'm disappointing people when I say that I'm not, you know, as queer as you would like for me to be. And that's obviously not a feeling that I should have, but in so many ways am I bothered by, you know, someone having an attraction to me, a woman especially, because women have way better taste in my opinion. Not really. I guess I just have that weird thing where I don't want for me being who I am to be a disappointment to people because I guess in so many ways I don't feel like I owe them that. I don't owe people this unfaithful retelling of myself because it identifies with them, you know? So I guess that's really what I wanted to say. And I know that maybe some people are not gonna be jazzed about me phrasing this way, but I wanted to communicate that because I do genuinely have a lack of knowledge when it comes to certain stuff, you know? I did a lot of research papers about queer stuff. I've done a lot of research about the queer community. I've done a lot of research about, you know, a lot of LGBT shit, but that's all stuff I've learned from books. Those are all things that I researched. They're not things I've actually experienced in my daily life. And I don't feel a desire to connect with the queer community, you know? Personally, I think the queerest thing about me is my polyamory. And y'all should already know, I haven't talked about it, but y'all should already know how I would feel about polyamory being something that's considered queer. You know, but that's the closest as I think I get, because that I think is, for where I am right now in life, as alternative, as outside of the norm as I am. You know, obviously I'm a trans person, so for many people that will always be outside of the norm, right? But I assimilated into society. And, you know, I've talked about this several times. If I never had a YouTube channel, if I never had this platform and I didn't feel this responsibility, I probably would never talk about being transgender. And that's my truth. So anyway, let me drink this tea because I'm thirsty after all that. Anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for joining me for this video. I would love to hear how you guys feel about this stuff. You know, again, a lot of my reaction to this is just, I don't like when things are projected onto me. And I think part of it too for me is I'm 28, you guys, you know? I've had so much time between me being a queer teenager reading queer theory and like really identifying with it, to me being who I am now, where I don't really think about being a trans person. If I didn't have a YouTube channel, it probably wouldn't come up. And so I'm actually really curious to hear from people who maybe are similar to me and also different from me, how much of being part of a queer community has factored into their life, right? And what does queer community mean to you? Do you know what I mean? What does that mean? I'm very curious what that means, because I've definitely been part of online groups, which I guess you could say is a community. But physically, I've never really participated in a space like that long term. I've tried to, but I've never really participated in a space like that long term. So I'm really curious what your definition would be, and if anything I've said is identifiable to you. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Right now, you should be seeing 2 videos that you can watch and continue to watch, you know, get your brew of true tea on this channel. I would love to hear your thoughts. Give me your true tea in the comment box below, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.